Welcome to the Yale Centre for British Art's online series, At Home, Artists in Conversation. I am Checinska, the Curator of African and African Diaspora Fashion at the V&A Museum in London. I'm delighted to welcome Grace Wells-Bonner to our programme today. Before we get started, I have a few housekeeping notes to share. Please note that this programme will be recorded. Your cameras and sound are muted and will remain so throughout the programme. We'll be using the Q&A feature located in your navigation bar to gather your questions for Grace, and they'll be answered at the end of the programme, but please do feel free to submit your questions as we go along. Yale University acknowledges that Indigenous peoples and nations, including Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Shakticoke, Golden Hill Paugussett, Niantic, and Owen-Nipiak, and other Algonquin-speaking peoples have stewarded through generations the lands and waterways of what is now the state of Connecticut. We honour and respect the enduring relationship that exists between these peoples and nations and this land. Grace Wells-Bonner launched her label in 2014 after graduating from Central St. Martin's. Established as a menswear brand, Grace's soulful tailoring soon expanded to womenswear. In 2015, she was awarded Emerging Menswear Designer at the British Fashion Awards. In 2016, following her first solo runway presentation, Ezekiel, she received the LVMH Young Designer Prize. In 2019, Grace was invited by Maria Grazia Chiuri to collaborate with Dior to reinterpret their new look silhouette for the Resort 2020 collection. Shortly afterwards, she won the BFC Vogue Designer Fund. Informed by broad research encompassing critical theory, musical composition, literature, and history, Grace embraces a multiplicity of perspectives, proposing a distinct notion of luxury via a hybrid of European and Afro-Atlantic approaches. In January 2019, she presented her first institutional exhibition, A Time for New Dreams, at London Serpentine Galleries. And this is where I first encountered Grace's work, and so it's here that we'll begin our conversation today. A Time for New Dreams allowed us to see research in the way that you see it, Grace, in this idea of research as an artistic practice. The title of the exhibition is borrowed from Ben Okri's volume of essays. And I know in the past you've described Ben Okri as writing a sacred script. And so we thought we would begin by reading Invocation for the Shrine, which was written in response to Grace's exhibition. Invocation for the Shrine by Ben Okri. Everything here is kind of true. The true magic is the magic of you. The world is the shrine, and the shrine is the world. Listen here to the revelations of Saint Time. Still your hearts and breathe like new. Center yourselves in the part of you that's most true. Every cell of your body is alive with vitality. Every thought in your heart helps shape reality. We're shaping a new reality today, and the way you shape a new shrine with the offerings of your spirit and the magical words of your hand. We're going to start a new kind of dreaming in this land. Awake, awake, awake. Awaken the new brotherhood of dreams. From these flowers draw new powers to build new towers without fear. It's fear that darkens the shrine of the world. It's greed that darkens the shrine of the heart. Stone at your feet, stone in the mind, frozen blood in the veins, dark rock in the heart. We need a new miracle of being human. We need a new miracle of being alive. Ancestors sleep in these shrines. Us their dreams illumine. They planted these flowers along with the black cloths of time, flowers that never die, flowers that open up into 1,000 forms of art and living, music in the flowers and flowers in the music. Dedicate yourselves to the shrine of living. Awaken your feet to the wisdom of the earth. Open your head to the wisdom of the heavens. Listen to the whispers of the fragrance of the survivors. Windrush, chain rust, slave burst, ancestors dreaming in the shrines, us their courage illumines. Shine a light so bright it burst all the darkness. Write the magic of our souls on the darkness of the night. Like stars that shine, streams out the brilliance of the ancestors, who with the clarity of their thought opened up new futures. Those triple locked steel doors that we open with the magic touch of a light charged spirit. Oh, but the spirits are singing in the hidden glow. The more they keep us down, the greater we will grow. They're rowdy and they know. They know the revelations of Saint Time, things that every day are becoming true, things that are coming up through the shine, coming up through me and through you. Grace, tell us about this invocation to the shrine and tell us about this wonderful exhibition, A Time for New Dreams.
You read that really beautifully, and it's so amazing to hear it again because it brings up a lot of memories. And Ben wrote that. I remember wanting, I guess Ben Okri's writing around kind of spirituality and mysticism shaped a lot of my thinking for this exhibition, along with writers like Ishmael Reed and also Robert Farris Thompson's writing. And part of the intention of this exhibition was to honour this sacred lineage and honour the role of writers in connecting us to origin in some way, creating these threads across time. And Ben worked really collaboratively on the exhibition, and the idea of A Time for New Dreams was to create shrines. And this idea came from Robert Farris Thompson's research and the face of the gods, which was kind of research into Afro-Atlantic altars and looking at kind of aesthetic threads across them. One thing Ben said to me while we were developing this exhibition, which encompassed existing works and new shrines that were created for the exhibition, he said that a kind of shrine comes into existence through the kind of activation, through invocation. So what he created for the exhibition were invocations for the shrine. So he's very much responding to the environment. So they're very specific to that space and to kind of opening that space. So it's really beautiful to hear that again, and his words really illuminate a lot of the intentions for the exhibition, but also the power of writing to kind of connect us and to help us to understand these strands. It's beautiful to hear that.
It's almost a kind of calling into being of the ancestors, or calling into being the ancestry and the lineage, rather than evoking. It's different, isn't it? This idea of invocation rather than evocation.
I think it's kind of welcoming a potential within the space and the collective engagement in creating that space. Yeah, I think it's just really powerful.
And so how does that relate to, on the screen we've got the Rashid Johnson piece, I think, one of the day beds. And so was this something that was specifically created for the show, or was it something that existed, or was it a found object that became part of a shrine in that moment of appearing in this exhibition?
Yeah, this is an existing series by Rashid Johnson. And I think one of the things I was thinking about when I was researching into shrines is I was seeing them as kind of portals into other worlds or other spaces or other states of being. And I remember talking to Rashid about this work and this idea of brotherhood and these kind of secret societies as well, where people kind of created a kind of language. And I was really interested in this idea of intellectualism, this gathering of people, whether that's within institutions or within communities, but people coming together to create a common language. and looking at this act of gathering as having a kind of spiritual dimension to it, the kind of relationship to spirituality within that practice. And this is something that Ishmael Reed wrote about as well. He wrote a text for this exhibition called The Mind as an Orisha, and it was basically looking at his intellectual practice as a form of spirituality. But I think what I was interested in is the potential of these environments and situations to transport you to another place, or the kind of suggestion of what could inhabit this space as well.
And for some people that might not be familiar with the term Orisha, could you maybe explain that before moving on, please?
So the Orisha is a god, and so I guess he was connecting to the kind of expansiveness of his practice, and I think also the connecting with the kind of multitudes of gods as well.
Kind of rooted in African spiritualities, isn't it? And I remember when we spoke before, you mentioned that, and I think it was Ishmael Reed that said, every man is an artist and every artist is a priest. And this idea of tapping into the idea of the multiple gods within.
Yeah, I think I was really interested in his idea of neo-Hoodooism, which kind of encompasses lots of different strands of spirituality and traditions, and playing this very close connection between artistic practice and spiritual practice. So I think this idea of the artist as a priest was really interesting, or the artist as a shaman, like it's a character that kind of came up and I was thinking about, and there's certain examples probably here. I mean, James Hampton being one, who was an outsider artist, but he would get kind of a calling that kind of guided him to create this environment, the shrine, the throne of the third heavens. And so this idea of revelations, the kind of running through him, and the kind of dynamic connection between spirituality and the act of creating an artistic practice, that kind of direct channel was really interesting to me. So James Hampton was someone I was thinking about, and someone that Ben kind of talks about, this idea of St. James. I think this was a name that he called himself, and the revelations. So there's kind of echoes of kind of things I was exploring within that language. But I think what I found interesting here is that James Hampton was creating privately. So it was only after he died that they discovered what he'd built in this warehouse. So the kind of act of needing to create, not for someone else, but actually for a spiritual purpose. I think that was kind of example of this.
It's almost creativity as a kind of compulsion and a calling. And so this image on the screen, so this is an altar that you created for the exhibition. Tell us a little bit more about this.
So this is coming back to the idea of honouring a certain lineage, or honouring this idea of the writer as an oracle and someone that connects us to a sense of ourselves. And so it was honouring collecting different writers, but Ben Okri's on the screen here, an interview of him talking about the famished road, which was a key reference also for the exhibition. Especially there's a scene where the spirit child, he's in a market and he kind of disappears into the market and ends up in another spiritual realm. So it's kind of the idea of these portals, or a shrine having the potential to kind of transport you somewhere completely different.
It's different geographies, but also different time. I remember you mentioning about your relationship to time and how that's woven into this exploration of spirituality and mysticism.
Mm-hmm. So I think part of that is, and part of how that came together in the exhibition, is kind of intergenerational call and response, but also kind of acknowledgement of what's come before and the writing, or the pathways that have been created, but also at the same time thinking about artists of my generation, so someone like Eric Mack or Paul Sapuya, and thinking about the potential to create a brotherhood across time, or like a kind of a connection across an ancestral connection, but across space and time. And I think this kind of irreverence or a playful approach to thinking about time is really important. It kind of brings a different rhythmical potential into exploring space.
A few things come up. You mentioned, you used the term rhythmical, and I know that when we spoke before, we both realised that we share a common reference point in Ferris Thompson's meditation on kente and polyrhythms, and how that can be, how the idea of the rhythmical or the polyrhythmical that you find in music, often in African music forms plural, whether that's in the Caribbean, in Africa, or in the diaspora. Maybe could you share something about this idea of rhythm and how that manifests in your own work?
I remember reading about the Mande strip textiles, and Robert Farris Thompson talked about the way it was woven was kind of an offbeat metric that was in harmony with a polyrhythmic composition. So I found that really interesting, the idea of actually being able to weave in a sense of rhythm within cloth on that level. And I think that I'm always very drawn to sound and experiences, and music plays a kind of central role in my research. And so as a designer, I'm always trying to somehow articulate a sound through clothing or through image making. That's a real challenge for a designer, like for anyone creating visual work. So I find that really fascinating. It's something I keep coming back to. But I remember part of what was really special to me about this exhibition, and also being able to speak to people that I admire and have really shaped my thinking around spirituality and Afro-Atlantic expression, was kind of acknowledging the role that fashion, it helped me to acknowledge the role that fashion actually plays within this wider aesthetic practice. And Ishmael Reed said to me that clothing is as important as drumming within a Black radical tradition. And that was really affirming for me to see, to kind of understand what a role clothing can play. And because I think a lot of my references come from outside of fashion, they come from art, they come from literature, they come from music. So I somehow felt a bit outside of that as a designer. So to kind of be embraced, and for actually the cloth to be like woven into an important part of everything, was really meaningful to me.
Absolutely. And I think it's great to sort of move on to Mumbo Jumbo, which is the collection that came out. Well, the exhibition almost culminated in the Mumbo Jumbo collection. And again, the title, is that borrowed from Ishmael Reed's book of the same name?
Yes, exactly. So I guess this kind of illustrates how I can come from a kind of maybe even an abstract research framework, and then how I think about translating some of those ideas practically into design. So I think this collection was presented within the exhibition. So within the kind of environment that it was imagined in. But I was thinking about this idea of intellectualism and the Black intellectual wardrobe and the kind of elements that make up that. So in that way, the approach is quite observational, kind of identifying certain elements that kept repeating themselves within the kind of images I was looking at. And there was two ideas, this idea of the Black intellectual, there's also the idea of the artist as a shaman. So there was these two kind of characters that I had in mind, but kind of borrowing from Howard University, lots of yearbooks from the 80s, and kind of looking at these repetitions and iconic garments and trying to create something that is a hybrid of something that's quite a traditional form, but trying to somehow disrupt it from within something familiar. So you even have some of the references here to St. James, to James Hampton that we saw earlier.
And one of the things I really love about your work is the way that you play with the proportions. So the varsity shirt becomes elongated, for example, and also thinking about this idea of rhythms. Yes, rhythms in cloth, but I think also rhythms in the way that a garment's styled. If I'm looking at the gentleman it's kind of a hybrid blazer in some ways, but when my eye scans it, there's this punctuation that happens from the piece of jewelry or the sculpture on the lapel, and then my eye goes down and it's punctuated again. And these are almost like sound explosions, because my kind of route into the idea of rhythm and cloth and rhythm and styling is through Kamal Brathwaite and his idea of nation language and the sound explosions in spoken word. I think that the patterned shoe and the piece of jewelry on the lapel are almost like sound explosions in the outfit that you've created there, because it's such an elegant ensemble. And then you have these kind of unexpected, which might echo the idea of the offbeat or the backbeat of music.
Mm-hmm. I think it's very observational in the way that I look at things and then try to bring them into a kind of the world that I'm trying to create. So there's a kind of familiarity to what you're seeing, but it's slightly disrupted. I think having that framework, having that wardrobe, or having certain traditions, like whether it's tailoring, having a kind of sense of familiarity, but then being able to disrupt, be playful within that framework, that's kind of where I thrive, I think, as a designer.
And then I think you had some other images of this collection. And
in the background is a work by Eric Mack, and he also created a textile piece that kind of was part of the garment as well, but it came from the market that we talked about in Famish Road. This kind of idea of someone emerging from that space into space.
Beautiful. It's really, really elegant. I'm going to move us on. I've got one eye on the time. And so maybe now let's segue into looking at your current collection that's just in store at the moment, which is the second of 3 series of collections, which is really interesting. So thinking about how you play with time and how you play with frameworks. So we're going to now share the Thinking Home film, which I think is a collaboration with Gino Edwards,
yeah.
Gino Edwards, thank you.
Waking in the morning, you know, the most beautiful place to be when the sun sets. It's all about life. Trust me, if you want to see peace, tranquility, watch the sun just fade below the sea. It's an immaculate view, man, you can't miss it. It's the most beautiful view, man. I love it. Walking up the in life, it can be a struggle, it can be a fight, but if you're committed and you're disciplined, you know, say, the top looks really nice. When I'm hiking, it's not the physical thing that I'm tired of or exhausted, it's just keeping my mind motivated. Follow to the sun.
Watch this. I don't sound can't play the tune for real. Sound of best.
Yeah, alright, yeah.
You can see
We'll have neither summer
watch
nor
the
winter,
sunset
neither autumn nor spring.
Knowing say me I go see a beautiful view.
Set the days when
as
the
the
cold
light
sun shines on the lush green
generally
fields.
blue
kisses the
But
ocean.
best of all, there are the days when the mango and the logwood blossom, and bushes are full of the sounds of bees and the scent of honey. Magnificent.
One of the best.
What color is the sky in the moon? I woke up and the sky was painted in a blue with a purplish tint.
Wow. Really, really beautiful. I can't wait to hear more about this. So it's shot in Jamaica, presumably?
Yes, it was shot in Kingston by Gino, who is a Jamaican filmmaker, and shot with quite a few models from Saint Models Agency, which is an agency I work with quite a lot. And I was in Jamaica early last year before lockdown and kind of started setting this up, but actually we kind of worked on that remotely. This is the Essence collection, but I'm glad that we could hear some of the sound as well, because I think that's such an important element of it all.
Absolutely.
You talked about this collection, Essence, and it's second in a trilogy of collections, which are kind of exploring diasporic connections between Britain and the Caribbean, and started with Lovers Rock, which is what I presented last January. And I was very inspired by the musical genre, but John Gotto's kind of portrait documents of photographs of this generation and kind of British Caribbean community in the 70s in London, but also outside of London. But he documented a kind of youth club in Lewisham. And it's kind of reference that I think about a lot and kind of reminds me of, feels so familiar, like his images and people like Charlie Phillips photography as well, kind of so familiar, like seeing these people just feels like my family. So it's kind of, this felt like a really personal connection. My dad's family grew up in Stockwell, well, some of them in Jamaica and then in Stockwell, and I just felt like I saw these faces I knew. And so in some way it took me a long time to come back to doing a collection that felt so personal. I kind of felt like I had to do different things to come home, and this really feels like a homecoming, and this idea of being able to explore this over 3 collections, that was really important to me, to be able to kind of stretch out time and to go in depth and to make the system and the rhythm of fashion work for me. So how can I stretch time within that? And it's a similar approach with this collection in terms of studying a certain wardrobe and looking at this time. There's a mix of different eras, like there'll be tailoring from the 60s and clothing from the 70s. So it's kind of like a mix of eras, and also a really interesting way of dressing that feels quite irreverent and playful. So I was really inspired by that way of dressing as well.
And then with the current collection, I think you mentioned one of the things that I find really interesting is the kind of honouring of the everyday people that you might see in a Charlie Phillips photograph, but then also you have musicians or music producers like Augustus Pablo, but then you also have Derek Walcott, and somehow they're all intellectuals. It's all part of this Black intellectual wardrobe that you explore.
Mm-hmm. I think so. The Essence collection was the next step, which is like moving on from the 70s, thinking about the late 70s, early 80s, but more situated in Jamaica, and looking at early dancehall and the kind of emergence of a sound and the clothing that went around that. But also someone like Augustus Pablo, he wears really beautiful shirts that look kind of like English shirts. Like there's this kind of way that clothing travels as well, and certain codes and certain ideas are adopted or also embraced in different ways. And I think what I find particularly special about looking at Black style is the way things are put together. It's this kind of playfulness and irreverence and confidence that actually gives the garments completely new meanings, and they can take on a completely different cultural context. So even dancehall musicians embracing sportswear, it gives sports outside of athletic. It's that a leisure sensibility that can be super elegant as well. So I think it's the kind of power to actually change how something is seen.
It's almost like sampling and mixing, isn't it, in music, the way that people dress. I'm actually just mindful that there's a flurry of questions in the Q&A box, so I'm wondering whether, and I'm just again noticing the time, Grace, if it's okay, I think I might move forward into questions, unless there's something else that you want to bring out that to sort of round off.
I'm really happy to have questions.
Sure, because I think that you and I could talk for another hour just between ourselves about your work. So, okay, I'm going to let me have a look through and see the questions that have come in. So lots of people saying thank you for joining us, Ms. Bonner, which is lovely. So a nice one to begin with. What motivated your decision to focus on menswear first?
I think we talked about this idea of framework and having kind of parameters. I feel like that's where I work best, or where I can invent. So menswear was interesting to me because it felt quite limited in scope, what is appropriate, what's been explored, and also the tradition of tailoring, there are kind of rules within it. For me to have something to play with, I see it as being able to vibrate within something. It still comes back to this kind of idea of music, but it's like being disruptive from within. For me, it's not about being an outsider and trying to create completely in contrast to an institution, which might be a kind of fashion institution. I kind of feel like I can influence from being inside something and playing with the codes, playing with ideas of what is.
It's almost an act of creolization in a way, isn't it? Because I know that that's also part of your work, in the idea of within the Caribbean, Creole culture is about shifting up what's in the framework and looking at something afresh to create something new.
I think also appreciating that multiplicity of perspectives and influences that create culture and create identity, and I want to show the hybridity of that. And the kind of interconnectedness and the mirroring and complication. I think it's working within this space has kind of allowed me to be more nuanced or more specific about.
Sure. I think the idea of a multiplicity of perspectives ties to another question that I can see here, which is asking about your studio practice. Do you work with others? What is the place of music in your studio? Do you listen to music while you work?
Good question. I think collaboration is really important to me, and I think a lot of what I create definitely comes about through dialogue and through exchange. So I think with any collection, I will definitely be in conversation with people around ideas, or I'll be speaking to, I'll be trying to connect with my inspiration and have my perspective be challenged by other people. I think that kind of helps me to kind of expand what it is, having multiple viewpoints. So when I work with different artists or writers or musicians around collections, that's a really important part of developing. But also speaking to the models I work with and the kind of people. When I first started designing, it was all my friends that were models and would come for fittings. So I develop a lot through fittings, but also through conversation, like how does this make you feel, and seeing how things can actually transform the way someone carries themselves. So I think I'm really inspired by the people that I see in my collections as well, and the way that clothing can kind of sometimes transform.
Sure, thank you. And then again, on the music, a lot of people are saying how much they love the use of dub music in the film and the British Jamaican vibe. People are really enjoying to see that. Someone here is asking what some of your specific music influences have been. How do you feel you articulate sound in your designs?
That's a good question. I think my musical interests are pretty broad, I would say. Someone like, I think with the film that I showed, there was a lot of research and exchange around the music, and that in itself, the different threads and rhythms were part of the research practice in a way, and kind of tried to be interwoven. So again, I see that as being part of kind of continuing a lineage or acknowledging where things come from. So I mentioned Augustus Pablo, I was thinking about the collection, also the Mighty Diamonds, and conversation with Gina around music, but it's very broad, my musical interests. But there are soundtracks to every collection and specific things I have in mind or I'm thinking about around different collections. So actually there is a playlist on Spotify called Aura Meets, which is around all the research for this Essence collection. So that's available online.
Fantastic.
And thinking about another musical collaborator that I have worked with, Laraji, who is also part of the Serpentine show, who creates devotional music and meditative music, is someone that I think about a lot, and actually has kind of been part of different things I've worked on. So it's quite broad.
Thank you. And then I have a similar question about your engagement with art, with visual art. What sparked your interest in art? And similarly, are there particular artists that you come back to?
I think I see kind of art, looking at artwork as part of the kind of research process. So in a way, I see myself as a researcher fundamentally, and that encompasses like literary research, visual research, photography, film, sound, and then I find outlets to express that body of research or express the world that I'm trying to create through different avenues. So whether the outcome is a film or whether the outcome is a collection or a publication, I think that's the fundamental practice. And artwork for me kind of helps me to understand an environment or a world that is around these characters that I'm exploring. So I'll be thinking about artworks, but I'll be thinking about the artist's wardrobe, and I'll be thinking about the environments they inhabit. It's quite holistic and immersive, the way that I think about this world and this idea.
So in a sense that and also this is really interesting, this idea that you think so much in the round. So you're creating a fleshed out world for this fleshed out character, and music is part of that. And there's a lovely question that's come in about movement, which we haven't really touched on. But I feel that when we spoke before, you spoke a bit around choreography or the way, or gesture even. So not sort of full on dance, but this idea of movement and how the body moves through space. Could you say something about the place of movement in your research and design process?
I think movement's definitely something I think about, and choreography has been a part of how I'll present collections, whether that's at the Lovers Rock Show or at the Serpentine Gallery. And I work with an amazing choreographer and artist called MJ Harper, who is a collaborator that will gather around the body of research, but then interpret that into movement and gestures that reinforce and expand upon the world or the characters that I'm exploring. But I think also gesture, movement, the kind of subtleties of that play a very important part in my understanding of beauty and my kind of articulation of beauty, and the way that someone carries themselves and the kind of pride and dignity that is connected to that. So I think the kind of subtleties of movement and ease play a role, definitely. But I think there's parts of what I do that are very subtle as well. There's lots of layers to it. So it's like what you kind of observe within that. But I think this shoot kind of speaks to that kind of gesture, but also looking at studio portraiture and photography. It's when you look at how people are standing, and that's so much part of the style of it as well. So it's inspiring how people carry themselves. And I remember that one collection, Ezekiel, this collection actually, a lot of models came from Jamaica and actually came from St. Models, the agency I mentioned. So that's when I first met some of the models, and one of them, JD, he kind of said like, oh, I feel like a prince, like wearing this, I feel like a prince. And his posture changed. And I think it's just quite beautiful to create clothes to reveal the beauty of someone or who they are in a way. I like the clothes to be able to show someone who they are in some way.
I think that that's really powerful. And I think what's particularly powerful is your use of the word beauty in relation to men and menswear. Often this is something that we don't really hear. And we were talking about elegance as well. Elegance, beauty, sophistication is so much part of what you do, but somehow it's not always what we see when we look at images of Black men. And so there's a wonderful flowering. I love the way you describe that particular model putting on the garments and feeling like a prince. And again, I love the kind of the language. So there's this wonderful tension between power and then also this sense of softness or vulnerability in some of the garments and some of the poses.
Mm-hmm. I feel there's a kind of gentleness and ease, which definitely connects to movement in my idea of beauty. When I think about what that is, it's definitely about gesture and a kind of gracefulness, a way of presenting yourself. I think probably I started creating also to reflect the beauty that I saw that feels very familiar to me, and I'm sure familiar to many people, but what I was seeing in the fashion industry wasn't how I was seeing Blackness represented. So I wanted to show a much broader spectrum of representation and kind of proliferate in that expansion and kind of that complication. And I think someone asked about artists that inspire me. I think probably one of the artists I always come back to is Kerry James Marshall, and this kind of proliferation of imagery continuing to like reinforce a sense of beauty, but also being quite strategic about that, about how that kind of enters both institutions and enters the marketplace as well. So I feel like I'm very inspired by the kind of need to like proliferate and to the importance of these images being visible and being able to offer that kind of range as well. And continuity, like it's not a trend, it's like a place to be, like this kind of studying or looking at fashion from a Black cultural perspective, looking at luxury from a Black cultural perspective. That's kind of the area. It's ongoing and it's expansive. And I think that I'm trying to demonstrate how expansive and
wonderful. And I think sadly we're kind of out of time, but I love what you've been saying in it by way of finishing, because I look at your collections and I look at your inspiration points, and it is rather like coming home, you know. And I think this idea of thinking home, the title of the film that you shared, it's a wonderful way to maybe conclude our conversation. And I hope that this isn't our last conversation. It perhaps might be our last public conversation for a while, but I just thoroughly enjoyed speaking to you. So thank you, Grace. We are officially out of time, but what I want to do for our audience is just to thank you again on their behalf. And I also want to say, please join us at the Centre for our next online artist conversation, which will be on Friday, May the 21st at 12 p.m. EDT with the artist Cecily Brown in conversation with Francine Prose, Distinguished Writer in Residence at Bard College, Annandale-on-Hudson, New York. And please also note that this series of fashion talks or fashion focus will continue, the next one being on June the 4th. This is at 12 p.m. EST with the British fashion designer Joro Oluwu in conversation with Valerie Steele, Director and Chief Curator of the Museum at the Fashion Institute of Technology in New York. Thank you.
Thank you very much.